For epilepsy, there is hope. Hey podcast listeners, Tori Robinson here for Epilepsy Sparks Insights, a podcast about epilepsy, epilepsy research, common comorbidities, and all of the fascinating science behind it. Whether you have epilepsy, are a family member, a neurologist, neuropsychiatrist, therapist, neurophysiologist, scientist, or researcher, Epilepsy Sparks Insights is designed to help you learn more about epilepsy from the other side of the table. I'm a person with epilepsy and some missing brain tissue. I hope to help bridge the unnecessary gap between patients, the public, and the aforementioned. Because epilepsy research and science are cool. Last week we had a great chat with Simon Keller, Professor of Neuroimaging and Neuroscience at the Institute of Systems, Molecular and Integrative Biology and Director of the Brain Lab at the University of Liverpool. This week we are talking to Professor Ley Sander, a consultant neurologist at the National Hospital for Neurology and Neurosurgery and head of the Department of the Clinical and Experimental Epilepsy at UCL Queen Square. A passion of Ley's is to work across the continents to empower those in low to middle income countries when it comes to epilepsy prevention, treatment, and seizure control. And Ley also has a talent for photography. Check him out on Instagram. Ley actually also works closely with the Chalfont Centre, which is home to 92 people in permanent residential care and supported living services, and has a dedicated epilepsy research centre. So, I start by asking Ley, is the Chalfont Centre a powerhouse for research?
Well, you need to see things in the context. Of course, Chalfont is part of Queen Square, is part of UCLH axis, the assessment unit for epilepsy within, the biggest tertiary referral centre in the country is epilepsy dedicated scan is at Chalfont. So, worldwide, a lot of protocols, a lot of scales, a lot of guidelines, they are referred as the Chalfont protocol, as the Chalfont seizure scale, as the Chalfont. The epilepsy world, Chalfont is quite a famous name.
It's really interesting, the history.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that we don't really know the sort of, sometimes we forget the history.
And recent history.
Yes, and I think that then we risk repeating the same mistakes we have made before.
And that's why it's so important, I think, for us to be sharing information to try and prevent other people, other cultures, other societies from making the mistakes that we have. Mm-hmm. Well, we're far from perfect, let's face it, but we can all learn from each other, right?
Yeah.
And I guess, is that why you're doing lots of work outside of the UK as well?
Yes, I think that this has always been part of I started my professional life, I knew exactly what I wanted to do. I had a clear view that I wanted to work with epilepsy. I had a sort of personal encounter with epilepsy as a paramedic, which left an imprint. And this sort of led my career choice to work with epilepsy, and that has been the sort of most of my professional life. Of course, I trained as a neurologist, but as soon as I was, I got my wings, I started working with epilepsy, most of my workload, and that has been the case ever since. But the fact that I have been working a lot outside in other countries, the reason for this is that I always was intrigued by the fact that the production of anti-epileptic drugs worldwide was quite small, comparing to the potential number of people with epilepsy worldwide. So, my field work for my PhD was done in Africa and in South America, and this was before air miles, was before travel, and I spent time seeing how bad it was the life for people with epilepsy in under-resourced places. Not only, I was aware of the treatment gap, but I also learned that the treatment gap was not a simple issue.
Right.
Just, not having drugs. Well, not having drugs, you would need drugs, you need a diagnosis. Having diagnosis, you need, some sort of infrastructure that will help but also the awareness that epilepsy is a sort of not a spiritual thing, but a brain, it's something of the body. It's also important because in many places where you have sort of autochthony cultures, epilepsy is usually related to spirits, and there's all sorts of stories about someone that has a seizure, is out for a few minutes, and then will be up and down, without any problems later. So in part of the world, that's a spirit that is in that person trying to get out.
Yeah.
So you can see that this is not really seen as a medical problem, but and then people won't they won't seek treatment. So the treatment gap is much wider than just not having the drugs, but it's the awareness of the problem. Then it's the availability of the diagnostic. Is someone going to confirm that this is epilepsy? It's going to be the accessibility to treatment and to diagnostic, and it's also going to be the sort of affordability.
Right.
If we sort of look around the world, many countries, the national expenditure on health per year is less than $20
per person.
So, yeah. And if we have a treatment, even a cheap epilepsy treatment nowadays, let's forget phenobarbital, but most treatments will be about $200, $300 a year. So you can see a country that is spending only, and they need to make priorities. And epilepsy is often not seen as a priority. So part of my work since I did my PhD in Africa and learning a lot about what was going on there, also trying to understand how we need to learn and how we need to, to take this experience to improve things, has led me to be involved in many projects over the years. So I have been back to Africa. I have done projects in Senegal, in Nigeria, and Cameroon. Been involved with some works and of course in Kenya. And this really just reinforced my commitment to trying to improve the lot of people with epilepsy in these sites. Because if we look worldwide, if we were to invest in basic sanitation, we could improve the life, we could decrease the burden of epilepsy in a big way. Let's say that, to develop a new drug nowadays costs well over $500 million.
Right.
But, if we were to invest this in providing clean water, sewage systems, basic sanitation, we could impact worldwide epilepsy in a much bigger way. One of the things people don't realize is the commonest risk factor for epilepsy worldwide are actually parasites.
Right. So tell us more about that, because nobody talks about it.
Yeah, because it's not a problem here.
Right.
And we tend to be very sort of what happens around us. But if we were to look worldwide, and we would have to say what's the commonest risk factor, let's put it that way, cause of epilepsy, may be responsible for as many as 10 to 15 million people with epilepsy worldwide, is actually a tapeworm. It's actually the pork tapeworm, Tinea solium.
Yeah.
And when actually humans, due to lack of basic sanitation, they mix up, feces with foodstuff and water. Humans can be the pig in the situation and be the intermediate host for Tinea solium. And for some reason, in humans, Tinea solium, the larva, the sort of cyst in between the adult and it actually has a tropism, has a tendency to go to the brain. Whilst in the pig, it goes to the muscle, in the hope that we will eat it.
The hope. These are cheeky things, aren't they? It's almost like they secretly evolve almost before our eyes, but we don't see it. And they're like, you're a nice host. We can breed in that. That'll work. Yeah.
Yeah. And it was very interesting to see in the early 1900s when the the sort of British military men started to come back from India after a sort of being stationed there, bringing back cystic psychosis from India. So it was very interesting that how this was found out and understood, and some of the observations that the doctors made in the well before any type of scan, they still stand. And we talk about basic epidemiology. So cystic psychosis, neurocystic psychosis, is when the tapeworm intermediate form colonize the human brain, and it can pass without any symptom, but if it's going to cause symptom, it's usually seizures.
Right.
So a lot of people in South America, Peru, Ecuador, Central America, parts of Paraguay, Brazil, Bolivia, in West Africa, in Madagascar, in parts of India, particularly sort of north part and south of India, parts of China, they have a lot of this bug. And you could argue that if we were to work, we don't have to eradicate the worm, because you could argue that it's not always the best thing to do. But if we could just separate human waste from the food supply or the water supply, we could do much more to preventing epilepsy worldwide. And this is not the only parasite that is associated with epilepsy. We have, for instance, nowadays it's becoming more and more circumstances are coming forward to a point and provide evidence that something called onchocerciasis, which was known to cause what's called river blindness,
right,
can also cause epilepsy. So that's another bug that we could probably do something about, to send it to where it belongs, and then decrease the number of cases of epilepsy, particularly in kids in vast parts of Africa. We have, of course, falciparum malaria, which can actually cause brain malaria or cerebral malaria. Kids that survive this often will have bad epilepsy afterwards. So you can see how, for me, working in this place has brought me in close contact with this reality, which we hardly see here.
Indeed.
But it's an important part of the load, of the burden that epilepsy imposes on the world.
And do you know what? I've said this multiple times to other people, and I think it's a really important message for governments. Going back to what you were saying, hardly any money is spent on healthcare in many poorer countries and areas. If these governments were able to spend more money in preventing the epilepsies, whether it be through providing cleaner water or whatever it might be, you're going to have a healthier population. You're going to have more people working. You are going to have more people being able to pay tax. You are just going to better the whole country, and people will vote for you. It's it's a huge benefit to an entire population, to better the lives of people affected by epilepsy, and I think that that's rarely seen.
There are two ways of looking at this. We have to sort of show that working in prevention in many of these countries, you could argue that they really have other priorities.
Yeah.
But making prevention, for instance, preventing stroke, they will prevent many cases of epilepsy.
Yes.
Which are brought on by stroke. Improving perinatal care, providing midwifery, providing maternity or pre and perinatal care, that could decrease the number of people that will have trauma at delivery, that will have problems during pregnancy, which later will translate into epilepsy.
Yeah.
So there's a number of things that, in my view, the way forward we should really be working on preventing as many cases of epilepsy as we could.
Now, what do we need? What do people listening to this podcast, and watching our video, what do we need to do in order to help people affected in this way?
Well, I think that it's very important that we need to always have a coordinated approach to, I have seen so many people, what I call missionary approach. They go and say, okay, I will help people here for a while. I will go and move, work, do this and that. But this sort of things are usually, they don't have sustainability.
Right.
The person then finished the time where they went, and when they leave, particularly if there's not really a proper infrastructure created,
right,
things are going to collapse. And sometimes they cause more problem. I have seen some of this missionary approach, bringing phenobarbital to areas, and then 3 years later, people go back to Canada or to Italy, where they come from, and then suddenly things they are not there anymore. So people then have withdrawal from phenobarbital, and that can cause more problems.
And increased risk of SUDEP as well, because I think SUDEP's, that issue is rarely covered as well, is it? We just talk about seizures and controlling those, but risks of SUDEP aren't covered.
Well, everything in the third world that I have come across, the death of young people with epilepsy is staggering. We have seen this in Africa. We've been publishing about this for a while.
Yeah.
We have published a series of studies from rural China showing that mortality is so high that when I came across this first time, I was so surprised, and I sort of said, that cannot be, they must be bumping off people with epilepsy. But then I realized, for instance, working in a part of China called Sichuan, where there's a lot of paddy fields,
right.
A lot of rice. So you have epilepsy, you're not able to immigrate to work, you're going to stay in your village, and the only thing you can do is work in the fields. And so you're in the paddy field and you have a seizure. So it's not surprising that in this area, the number of people with epilepsy drowning is 80 times higher than the drownings in the general population.
80 times higher?
80 times higher than in the general population.
So for issues like that, what do we do? How do we help people?
There is quite a lot China has done. I think that you may have which wheels that China you want to have, but they really have taken seriously epilepsy. They have taken this as a very low priority to, quite a high priority. Epilepsy centers, tertiary, secondary, have been created in, and there is a national epilepsy program. So millions of people have been treated within this program.
Okay.
They have been identified. Can you imagine a BBC One presenting a 40 minutes program on epilepsy, teaching about epilepsy?
Wouldn't that be wonderful?
About 20 years ago. So, it was like BBC One having trying to tell the population that epilepsy was a problem of the brain. So China has really done this, and the other country that has done quite a lot in trying to improve, decrease the treatment gap has been Brazil. And both of these countries had in common was a demonstration project in the late 90s, 2000s, where they were trying to see what could be done to demonstrate that epilepsy care could be improved. And I think that China is by a long way the flagship of this WHO International League Bureau program, Epilepsy Out of the Shadows. And the legacy of this is that in China nowadays is at the forefront of providing epilepsy care, and they're really making strides in the research front. This was even reflected recently on an article in The Lancet about how epilepsy has progressed in China. But it's too bad that we don't see this in other places. It can be done. You could argue that in China doing things is different. if you have the goodwill of the right people, it happens. But it might not be too easy in other places. But I would actually always say that the example of what happened in China, just tells me very strongly in loud sound that things can be improved for epilepsy, for people with epilepsy.
And that also improves things for carers and stuff as well, like mums and dads and siblings. I often hear about lots of siblings, understandably, get kind of not pushed to one side, but left.
This is a very common thing, having someone with epilepsy, particularly if it's active epilepsy, impose a burden on brings shame to families in many countries. I have seen in Africa kids been more or less incarcerated, shackled to the wall of a house because they had epilepsy and they could not be seen by anyone. And this is I have seen, it's not they told me. So this sort of things do happen, particularly because of the stigma that epilepsy still carries. It's quite strong in many places. But working to decrease the stigma is something else that we should actually be doing. We need to sort of work decreasing or bringing down the stigma around epilepsy, and then trying to prevent as many cases as we have. And this would be a good way forward.
It's a very long-term project, but there are huge steps that we can take relatively easily. But I think, for instance, as you know, I'm a person with epilepsy trying to talk about it and raise awareness. Do I look like somebody with epilepsy? Not that I'm aware of. There is not a look, right?
No, there is not a look. For many people, this is something that affects them 1 or 2 minutes every so often. And 99.9% of the time, there's nothing to say.
Yeah.
But in many places still, calling someone epileptic is an insult.
Yeah. Well, even I remember at school, people would say, "Oh, epi attack," if somebody freaked out, and as in somebody got stressed out, and I would find that really offensive. And darling, you have no idea what it can be like to have a seizure, and don't say that as a derogatory statement, because how offensive is that? And I know it's happening less over here now, but the fact that does still happen, we're all of the same species across the world, and we all have these tendencies to say very inappropriate, offensive things. But I guess because we're all, a great percentage of us are now online and we can share information, I think it's an opportunity for us to share credible information, and for us to see people who are able to sometimes achieve things. I don't know if I told you before, I was in India before lockdown, and I would have I was there to speak about the epilepsies, and family members could not believe that one had travelled on my own when I have epilepsy. And I thought it was it's quite shocking for me, but then it made complete sense, because if you are in a society in which there is such a great stigma about epilepsy, there isn't easily available information. Lots of clinicians even aren't up to date on the latest. It's understandable.
Yeah, in India, it was only in the 1980s that the constitution changed, or the law changed. So before that, if a partner found out that the other partner had epilepsy, that would lead to an annulment of the wedding.
Right, I heard that.
I think that the fact that people see you there, that you travel, that gives a good role model for them, saying they can actually, people with epilepsy can can be there, they can travel, they can do anything. So it's very important for people to have these role models, even if they are coming to visit from another country.
Yeah, they had this nutter coming over, who is she? But then, what, kind of contradicting what you say, I think it's very important for us to accept a lot of us do have some limitations. But that's nothing that one should be ashamed of. If I can't drive, both legally and ethically, it would be ridiculous for me to attempt. But I try and find ways around that. I wanted to be a commercial pilot or a surgeon. That wasn't going to happen, and it shouldn't, because but I'm doing my best to try and help people in other ways. But it is a sort of, it can be a hard thing to get over, especially I think if people are diagnosed later in life. So like, for instance, like you say, if you have a stroke, which generally happens in older people, you have to give up a lot. Yeah. And that can be really almost traumatizing for people. I know a lady who had a brain tumor and developed epilepsy, and she's like, what do I do now? She can't do her job, she can't drive, So I think, there are different issues for different people, right?
Absolutely, and the way things affect people, they're very different according to, the person's expectation, the person's perception, the person, sort of environment. And, and in some societies, this can be even more, it can lead to very different, let's put it that way, impacts on the person. I have only seen one thing that I always tell people, that a sort of positive thing of having seizures that was seen like let's put it that way, a positive stigma. And this was a sort of Amerindian group in the Andes, in the sort of border between Colombia and Ecuador, where for you to be able to be a shaman, which is a very important post in the society, you had to be touched by the rainbow. And to be touched by the rainbow, people would say, if he was touched by the rainbow, they have a seizure. So that was the sort of only thing I have ever come, because everything else has been sort of relatively negative. We have recently been able to interview people from a specific community, 5 different groups within this community, about the beliefs about epilepsy, and it was quite interesting to see that most of them sees epilepsy around the spiritual things. So this is a recurring issue that we do not see this when we see it from a rational point of view, but understanding these sort of things would be very important for us to go and try to improve things, because we need to work with what people believe.
True, yeah, exactly. And not come in, like I think some people approach these situations as if they think, well, I am higher than thou and you must listen to me. That is not going to work. It's so disrespectful as well.
You cannot just parachute yourself into a situation. You need to really work with what's there.
Yeah.
I sort of have a very strong memory of a scene in my clinic where I was talking to a person from an ethnic background, and we were discussing the jinn that had been in this person that was causing seizures. And my drug was actually fighting the jinn very well, because he didn't have a seizure. One of my junior doctors saw that and felt very upset, saying that I was propagating superstition. But I said, well, I spend twice a year 10 minutes with this person. This person goes back to their family, the grandmother, aunties, everyone around. Who are they going to listen?
Yeah.
So if I align myself to what they think, and this is working, this is good, it's a good outcome. So, because otherwise, if I try not to take this into account, and trying to tell off, you shouldn't believe it. It's not like that we should do it, because people have these strong beliefs, and us trying to understand what people see as their health and the cultural beliefs about health seeking, for instance. You will only seek health help if you think that something is to do with the body.
We all have our presuppositions, don't we? Whether we are conscious of them or not. And I think just being open to one another, and rather than poking, a paper in front of somebody and saying, well, darling, you should read this, and this is going to prove that your presuppositions are wrong. It's certainly not going to help, I think, both short and long term. And we should just be open to one another and, you know, provide each other with information about culture, about beliefs. And there's nothing wrong, I think, with talking about this stuff. And as long as we're not being aggressive about it and we're just providing people with, I don't know, like help, information, and help, and knowing that one another is there if somebody has a question, that's great, right?
We should never think ourselves, as you said, above or superior.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we need to take, and it's an exchange.
Yeah.
You know. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you know, we need to always looking how we're gonna use all this information, how we're gonna use this to go to the next step, which is to actually sort of try to do something that will improve the life of people, but not the life that we think is good life for them, but the life that they think is a good life for them.
It's like empowering other people, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because if you feel empowered, stronger, then life becomes quite different. And that is really important for us, no matter the continent upon which one resides. It's so crucial. I know that you're doing work with Helen Cross, Arjun Sen. You've got this organisation, and I can't remember what it's called. Sorry, what's the name of it again?
Epina.
Yes, and so can you just tell us a little bit about that and how people can find out more if they're interested?
It's a project sponsored by the NIHR.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, going to the NIHR site, you will find information about it. Epilepsy in Africa, and it will come up. This is work that has been carried out. It's been affected by COVID as everything, but it's to provide improvements in the way that people seek help. We're using modern technology like mobile phones. We're using internet to create ways that we can actually remotely diagnose, that we can actually monitor things, you know, trying to improve on adherence with people, and this is work that we hope will we will be able to scale it up and to expand it in other places. We need to be very realistic that you know, most sub-Saharan African countries, they will have one neurologist for every 100,000 people. Yeah, so you cannot expect that, you know, there will be a neurologist everywhere to diagnose epilepsy. Many countries don't even have a scanner, an MRI scanner. So, you know, you need to actually see how other things that we can use, you know, how can we use this more of a global village nowadays to provide help. Africa is very advanced when it comes to using their mobiles for finances. You know, Kenya, the M-Pesa system is brilliant. It's one of the sort of very early you know, people getting to a more or less cashless society. And the instrument is the phone. So if we could harness this sort of things to improve their health, that would be great. And this is what we're trying to do through this program.
That's so uplifting, because most of the stuff, as we were kind of saying, about epilepsy is pretty horrific. But knowing that there is hope out there and that we're reaching out to one another to learn from one another, and, you know, and again, know that there is hope. I think that that's really cool. And also, just referring back to what you brought up earlier, the whole worm situation. Most people have no idea about these worms.
Yeah.
And do you know what? I saw a video recently of a charity traveling to one African country, and the lady had gone to the loo for a number 2, not washed her hands, then went to prepare food for her child and the visitor, the film crew, and there was feces on it. And they just, and this is like today that this still happens.
Yeah.
And but the lady just had not been told that washing one's hands was a great idea in order to help prevent infection and contamination.
You know, this is what I'm saying is part of the idea of providing basic sanitation.
Yeah.
It's also to teach people what it means, and not teaching, but helping them to understand what it means. Who are us to teach? We might share our experience that we do this might not happen. So this is and it would go a long way in decreasing problems worldwide if we were to invest in public sanitation, basic sanitation.
It's such to us a simple thing, but yeah. Thank you so much for joining us to raise awareness of this. Honestly, it's so wonderful. And look, everyone listening or watching, we're only a few hours flight from everybody else in the world, but there are distinct differences in quality of life, quite frankly, but sanitation and access to healthcare, and that needn't be. It really shouldn't be. So, but there is hope. So look, we have Professor Ley Sander here. Thank you so much for your time. And we will no doubt, hope, see you again. Thanks so much to Ley Sander for telling us a bit about what's happening for many people affected by epilepsy in low to middle income countries, what he and his colleagues are doing to help them, and perhaps helping many of us realise how lucky we are in comparison. One of Ley's most recent papers is regarding the role of common genetic variants for epilepsies with drug resistance to specific anti-seizure medications. Check out the link below. Next week, I shall be chatting to Professor Gavin Woodall, a neuropharmacologist from Aston University, Birmingham, UK, and Director for the Institute of Health and Neurodevelopment. Or, as Gavin would say, mostly I just run a lab. Follow me on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook, and we'd love to hear from you if you have any thoughts about today's show. Do subscribe to our podcast and know that we are always trying to improve what we are doing here for the programme. I'm Tori Robinson. Thanks for listening.